Lesson 3, Chapter 4. This chapter examines developments in the last half of the 18th and early 19th centuries, and notes that although there were internal and international forces for change and revolution, forces of unity were stronger in Britain. Britain did not have a revolution, as France did, and in fact the relationship between Scotland, England, and Ireland grew closer as Ireland was incorporated into the United Kingdom. In 1760, King George II died, and he was succeeded by his grandson, who became George III. The grandson succeeded the grandfather, because George II's eldest son and heir, Frederick, Prince of Wales, had died in 1751. The throne thus passed from the presumptive heir, Frederick, to his eldest son, who became George III. George III sought to revitalize royal political power in Britain. He chose his own former school tutor, the Earl of Bute, as his prime minister, which was technically his right, but Bute had few qualifications besides his close ties to the king. Worse still for many, Bute was Scottish, and there was widespread antipathy in some political circles to the Scots, who were, fairly or not, tainted with Jacobitism and were largely not trusted. Bute's appointment thus created an opening for questions about governance in Britain, including the parliamentary franchise and the existence of rotten and pocket boroughs, as discussed in the text. The franchise was most limited in Ireland, where, because of the penal laws, all Catholics were barred from voting in elections. This restriction was only partially lifted in 1793 for more wealthy Catholics, and one must remember that Ireland was a mostly Catholic country. If the Tory Bute was an improbable choice for Prime Minister, so too was the main Whig critic and one of the loudest voices for political reform. John Wilkes, known as the ugliest man in Britain, in Parliament and through his newspaper, North Briton, focused his criticism on Bute, who Wilkes satirized and ridiculed as an immoral, disloyal Scottish Jacobite. Bute resigned the premiership 3 years later. Wilkes's power and popularity continued to rise after winning the libel case brought against him for criticizing the king. It is a long-standing tradition that parliamentarians are protected from libel for what they say in Parliament. This is why, to this day, MPs may say things much more directly, forcefully, and damningly in Parliament than they would dare say outside of Parliament in public. The manner in which Wilkes repeatedly won elections to sit in Parliament, but was expelled by the Tory government, only confirmed the tyranny of the king and his ministers in the eyes of Wilkes's supporters, known as Wilkites. There were, of course, more moderate reform voices, such as Christopher Wywell, as noted in the text. Wilkes's anti-Scottish campaign was not a unique prejudice, but was in fact widespread and long-standing. The Jacobite threat was real and posed a security concern for the British government, which responded with a policy of incorporating the Scots more fully into the Union. To defuse the potential threat, Scotland should be transformed from a region which threatened rebellion to a loyal partner of the Union. More Scots were recruited into government, into the army, and into the administrators of the British Empire, for example, into the ranks of the East India Company. This policy created more loyalty and provided tangible benefits for sections of Scottish society, and indeed many Scottish thinkers, such as the economist Adam Smith and the philosopher David Hume, made great contributions to Enlightenment thought, and helped Edinburgh become an intellectual centre. The text raises the interesting ideas of historian Linda Colley, who in her book Britons Forging the Nation wrote of the invention of Britishness in the 18th century. This forging of a national identity arose in large part as a contrast to Britain's great rival, France. What Britain was in a sense, what was not French. France and the French institutions and policies were the other. France was authoritarian, tyrannical, with no voice for the people. It was also Catholic, where England, Scotland, and Wales were Protestant. Frequent war with France, including the 7 Years' War, helped shape this national identity, and the identity was more than a contrast. It furthered the unity of the people from the three nations, the three British nations, Britain, Ireland, and Scotland, drew them together. If Scotland had posed a security threat for the lingering support of Jacobitism, Ireland was a greater threat. Not incorporated into Union, and with majority population of Catholics who were by law held down and oppressed for being Catholic, there was a real fear that disloyal elements of Ireland might partner with Catholic France against England. Indeed, there was a very real fear that Ireland could become a stepping stone for a French invasion of England, a backdoor launching point. The majority of Irish people, as Catholics, had much to be dissatisfied with in the existing political relationship with Britain. So too did the Protestant minority population, the most powerful of which were known as the Protestant ascendancy. Their dissatisfaction arose from the constraints on political power in Ireland. Although Ireland had its own parliament in Dublin, all potential legislation had first to be approved by the British government before it could even be discussed in the Dublin Parliament. Thus, from the 1770s, in the context of Enlightenment ideas and the principles espoused in the American Revolution, a Patriot Party or group arose in Dublin which sought to regain the Dublin Parliament's independence. When an Irish militia movement known as the Volunteers arose to protect Ireland from invasion, when previously stationed troops were sent to fight the Americans, the British government took note. 80,000 Irishmen in arms, though ostensibly for the protection of Ireland, posed a threat as they could be turned to other use. The result was a shift in policy in 1782 which returned the Irish Parliament's independence. This placated the politically powerful Protestant minority. Remember, only Protestants could become MPs, and only Protestants could even vote in elections. To mollify some of the more well-off sections of Irish society, such as merchants and landowners, the penal laws were gradually modified. The 1790s were the key decade because of the events occurring in France, the overthrow of the old system in the French Revolution. Gradually, wealthier Catholics were given the parliamentary vote and were allowed to practice law, to own guns. These acts, which repealed certain penal laws, were known as the Catholic Relief Acts. Catholics would have to wait until 1829, however, to actually be able to become an MP. As discussed in the text, the 1798 rebellion had far-reaching implications, the most important of which was the new Union, the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Ireland posed a security threat. Union bound it closer to Britain. Dublin lost its parliament, and tighter control of Ireland was now achieved in Westminster. The text goes into some detail on the nature of religion and religiosity in Britain, pointing to the dominant nature of the Anglican Church as the official state church, but also noting its difficulties in infrastructure and, to an extent, relevance to urban and industrial communities. Many dissenter churches and groups were better placed to fit these needs. Still, the United Kingdom was a thoroughly Protestant state, even if there were many non-Anglican sects, and, especially in Ireland, more Catholics than Protestants. In the chapter theme of unity, Protestantism was a unifying force and formed a large part of British identity, even if when looked below the surface there was a much more complicated reality. The discussion on innovations in agriculture illustrates how changes in the economy, and in particular land use patterns, could have profound social consequences. The enclosure movement of the mid-18th to mid-19th century transformed agricultural efficiency, but displaced many small landholders who were forced off the land to become laborers. It further concentrated landholding and ownership in fewer and fewer hands. For the displaced former landholder forced to sell his labor, this was a great hardship and turned their world upside down. The surplus labor, however, found a very important outlet in enabling the industrialization of Britain. Enclosure also led to a great new growth in road networks, including turnpikes. In politics, the Whigs and the Tories were dominated by two very different figures, Charles James Fox and William Pitt the Younger. Bute's appointment as PM in 1762 by George III signaled the return of the Tories to a major political role for decades. The Whig Party, that had so dominated British politics throughout the 18th century, splintered into factions, thereby hindering its effectiveness as a dominant political force for the rest of the century. Fox, the most prominent Whig leader, had very radical views for a mainstream politician at the time, supporting the abolition of the slave trade, supporting the American Revolution, at least before the enemy France had joined it on the American side, and supporting the removal of more civil disabilities against Catholics, among others. Pitt the Younger was only 24 years old when he became PM in 1783, and as the text notes, was very accomplished in reviving the state's financial footing and helping to change the moral climate of politics in Britain. Developments in France were keenly watched. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, there was a wait-and-see attitude. Many in Britain hoped that the revolution would not radicalize, but would rather make France more like Britain, by instituting a constitutional-style monarchy, where the power of the king would be checked by parliamentary institution. When the revolution did radicalize, and French armies began attacking its neighbors, the hope turned to disappointment and fear of invasion. Britain went to war with France in 1793, and remained at war, except for a couple of years, for the next 22 years, until Napoleon was finally and definitively defeated. The text does a good job of discussing the challenges of the army, navy, and the government in raising revenues to pay for nearly 22 years of conflict. Following Napoleon's abdication in 1814, the resulting Treaty of Paris returned France to its 1792 borders, and an international peace conference was convened at Vienna, Austria. While the conference was meeting from November 1814 to June 1815, the unthinkable happened, and Napoleon escaped from his exile from the island of Elba to return to France and take up another great army, only to be defeated at Waterloo in Belgium. The Congress of Vienna enacted a European settlement based on the principle of a concert of Europe, or what might be deemed a balance of power. No one state should dominate Europe, and the concert could be maintained through systems of alliances to prevent another great and devastating war. Britain was now the premier power, but its government concurred with the Vienna principles that a balance of power would suit Britain's interests in preventing another large multi-nation war. Consider the cost for Britain to fund 22 years of war from the 1790s until the 1810s. A policy which could help prevent another major European war was one the government would support. Supporting the balance of power meant also supporting, or at least accepting, the protection of absolute monarchies under the system, although Britain increasingly came into conflict with several of the most conservative and autocratic regimes in Europe, particularly those of Austria, Prussia, which was the dominant German state, and Russia. These three nations formed the Holy Alliance to protect their mutual interests of hereditary monarchy and to govern through an identifiably Christian view. Britain was asked to join, but passed. Britain's war with France complicated security matters and international relations further when war erupted between Britain and America in 1812. The War of 1812 clearly illustrated that matters between Britain and its former colony were not settled by the American Revolution. And indeed, historian Alan Taylor has framed the war as a civil war, pointing to the close connections to Americans and those in British Canada. Tens of thousands of British colonists had fled rebellious America during and after the Revolution to settle back in British lands in Canada. The war ended as a draw, and the Treaty of Ghent affirmed the borders status quo ante bellum. At the least, Canada would not be annexed to the new American Republic. The tumultuous last 3 decades of the 18th century raised interesting ideas about the nature of political change. Did citizens have inherent individual rights by virtue of their citizenship? Should women have the same rights as men? What was the best form of government? Constitutional monarchy? Democratic republic? The text discusses the ideas of the Irishman Edmund Burke, the Englishman Thomas Paine, and the Englishwoman Mary Wollstonecraft.